This talk, I'm going to show how to shoot divers, part 2, close focus wide angle. As I stated before, it's fun to show a picture of your dive buddy, friend or family in the ocean with marine life. It's really cool if you can pull a close focus wide angle, ideally with an animal in the foreground and the diver behind the animal in the context of the reef. You can use a compact camera, but you need a wide angle lens attachment. The wider the better. Or you can use the SLR camera with a wide angle lens, preferably even a fisheye lens. A lot of times we use what's called focus lock, where we will focus on the subject in the foreground, okay, lock the focus, then recompose the picture to get everything you want in it, where the focus is still locked up close on the foreground subject. The reason this is important is there's better depth of field near the subject and then behind it. So if you can get the subject in focus with adequate depth of field, everything behind it will be in focus. Compact cameras have a small lens to sensor distance, and with wide angle lenses you'll have great depth of field. With an SLR camera, even with a wide angle lens and the excellent depth of field they provide, we generally need to close our aperture somewhat to maximize good depth of field. By closing the aperture, however, we're allowing less light in. So we use strobes to fill in some lighting, color, and clarity in the foreground, but we have to use our shutter speed and ISO setting to get adequate background lighting. Now, a shutter speed can be slowed down somewhat because a flash will stop the action in the foreground, but if the shutter speed gets to be too slow, then we'll have movement from camera movement or object movement. And that way, if the shutter speed gets too long, we can make it faster again and then bump up our ISO. That'll give us better lighting. However, with an increased ISO, we have to be careful because we can get some grain and noise in the picture. One quick thing about strobe positioning. I usually keep my strobes slightly behind the dome port and oriented straight ahead or even slightly out to minimize backscatter. We just have to look at our histogram, however, to make sure we had adequate exposure and we haven't blown out the details, and we have to make sure that the foreground is illuminated. If we're getting real close to the subject, we can bring our strobes in and sometimes even point them inward somewhat. Okay, let's look at some examples of close focus wide angles of divers. Here we have a beautiful sponge in the foreground and a diver, two divers actually, in the background. This picture is somewhat disappointing for two reasons. Although I have adequate lighting and focus, the sponge, the base of the sponge appears to be cut off, and the diver does not have a good profile. It's an open profile, not necessarily looking at the subject. So somewhat disappointing overall. This image, however, is much more pleasing. I have good color exposure in the foreground. The coral doesn't really look cut off at the base, and the diver has an excellent horizontal compact profile, no bubbles, no dangling equipment, and you can see some of the undersurface above because I got down low and shot up. I was quite close to the coral. The diver looks pretty far away, but in fact he was only 3 or 4 feet behind the coral. Here's a shot of a coral in the foreground, the base cut off, the diver looking the wrong direction, and I had only one strobe and I got a bit of a harsh lighting to the left with distracting shadows. That's why sometimes with wide angle it's preferable to use 2 strobes. This picture I particularly like. It shows nice coral in the foreground with a diver and a complementary curve in the background, again with a relatively compact profile, adequate lighting and no bubbles, no mergers and no amputations. This also is a pleasing picture with a bright orange sponge in the foreground and an adequately focused and illuminated diver slightly behind it. There's a few other challenges when looking at composing close focus wide angle with an animal and a diver. Now we have to ideally have the animal facing the camera, or at least get a horizontal profile of the animal, and have the diver with a good profile facing the animal, and at the same time avoiding mergers, and amputations, and adequately lighting all the subjects. So I was very excited to capture this image of a beautiful turtle with my wife while snorkeling in Hawaii. Unfortunately, most of my attempts were disappointing. Here I have the turtle in focus, my wife behind the turtle, but she's facing the wrong direction, and the turtle is not well illuminating. I was shooting available light, and the sun was in front of me rather than behind me, so the turtle was dark. Here I have better exposure, but I could not separate my wife from the subject, no matter how hard I tried. We have a merger there, and it just looks somewhat awkward. This was the best I could do with numerous attempts. I have my wife slightly above the turtle, looking at the turtle, taking a picture, but I have a merger of my wife with the turtle, and the camera is tilted such that you can see the horizon is tilted. This picture is somewhat better. It's a close focus wide angle of a beautiful angelfish with my dive buddy, only about 4 or 5 feet behind the angelfish, although he looks to be 50 feet behind by the size perspective. This is a decent picture of my dive buddy with another angelfish. However, we have a little bit of a merger of my dive buddy with the reef and some distracting bubbles. This is a better picture. The diver has a compact stance. However, the fish is slightly away from me. It would have been better if the fish was looking toward me. This is a pleasing picture. This is my wife taking a picture of a flying gurnard, which as she approached, got it to actually go slightly toward me, and it opened up its fin. So we have a good diver profile, no dangling equipment, minimal bubbles, a nice blue water background, and a nice fish in the foreground, all in relatively good focus. This is a picture of my dive buddy behind a school of Southern Senate at Grand Cayman. Everything in focus, adequately lit. This is a picture of my daughter snorkeling in Grand Cayman at night, and she was able to get this porcupine fish to orient its body toward me, and I think it's somewhat interesting, even though I partly cut off my daughter, and that both of their faces are tilted. They have a similar expression with their mouth and eyes, and both looking sort of, the porcupine fish looking toward me and my daughter looking toward the animal. Here's a picture of a snorkeler with a jellyfish. A good profile, and you can see the reflection, no merger, no distraction, and no distracting bubbles. Here's a picture of my dive buddy with an eel at about 90 feet depth in Grand Cayman, and I was able to use strobes to evenly illuminate the colorful foreground and bring back some colors and contrast and clarity. This is a picture taken with available light while snorkeling in Hawaii with my wife, with her in the background and a beautiful red sea urchin in the foreground. And finally, this is a picture of my dive buddy diving in the Keys with a large, beautiful southern stingray in the foreground, and my dive buddy demonstrating good profile with no merger in the background. I hope you enjoyed close focus wide angle with divers. Please check out my other videos at my website, www.theaquaticeye.com. And one final thing. When taking pictures underwater, always remember, safety comes first. Yourself, your dive buddy, no damage to the animal or reef, and it really, really helps, if I can say one other thing, to know your camera setup cold before your dive trip. Thank you.